you're probably not growing quite in the right way. You probably need to challenge yourself a little bit more. You probably need to dig a little deeper and uncover some uncomfortable moments for yourself to actually experience some real growth.
Welcome to the Weekly Leadership Experience, a place for leaders to get inspired, be challenged, and grow. I am your host, Reshad Oberlander. Let's get started. Today's episode of the Weekly Leadership Experience is brought to you by my 7-day Leadership Growth Challenge. It's a free challenge that I've created, and it's delivered by email over the course of 7 days. I've created 7 compelling questions to challenge various aspects of your leadership, the way you lead, and why you lead. Go to ReshadOberlander.com and scroll down until you find the 7-day Leadership Challenge, or look for the link in the show notes. This week's review comes from The Happiness Recipe from Apple Podcast in the US for a rating of 5 stars. It says, a consistently thoughtful take on leadership. I really appreciate Reshad's podcast. He always brings forward great nuggets of wisdom from his guests and from himself. I appreciate his truly thoughtful take on leadership. Well, thank you so much for that review. I appreciate you taking the time for the kind words. It really means a lot to me. If you have a review you'd love to leave, I'd appreciate it if you would reach out and do that as well. Go to ratethispodcast.com/weeklyleader and leave me your rating and review. I'd love to read it out on a future episode of the Weekly Leadership Experience. Hello, leaders, and welcome to this week's show. Glad you've joined me today. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to show up and listen. Today, I want to talk about growing like you mean it. And there are 3 main points that I want to talk about today. The first 2 are essentially things to know, so things to get in your head, part of your mindset, if you will. And the third point is something for you to do. So leadership growth obviously is something that's really important to me. It's something that I always try to keep doing, is to keep growing, to keep learning, always seeking new information, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, and new ways that I can help my team. Growth is essentially, if you think about the way a plant grows, is something that starts as a seed and begins to sprout and begins to grow and flourish into a plant. If you think of the opposite of that would be the plant withering and dying, which is not really truly the opposite of growth in the sense of improving your capacity. But if you're not growing, you are likely to be stagnating, kind of becoming, stuck and maybe kind of bogged down in some old ways or old habits or old ways of thinking. And if you're not moving forward, you're definitely going to feel a little bit of that stagnation effect. Now, if you're tuning into this podcast, I'm going to assume that generally speaking, you're probably interested in growth for yourself and for your team, that you are probably wanting to improve yourself, that you are probably wanting to become better and grow and improve yourself as a leader. So, this is a little bit like speaking to the converted, but, there's a couple of things here that I think we all need to think about, remember, and, we can always, help our teams in the same way. So, first point is that leaders need to always be learning, which is kind of like a yeah, duh moment, but it sounds like it's too obvious. But when you think about leaders always need to be learning, sometimes we feel like there's information overload. Sometimes we feel like I've done enough learning for today. I've done enough learning, but like your brain is always on. Like the old idea that you only use 10% of your brain capacity is somewhat false. I mean, it depends on how you want to define that, I guess. But the research that I've been reading about how much brain capacity and how much brain function is actually going on. Like to say that we only use 10% of our brain capacity is ridiculous. Like actually most of our brain is active most of the time, whether it's on unconscious things that are automatically happening in your body, or whether your brain is taking in information from the outside and internal environment
and processing it and how it's actually being utilized. It's actually a very active part of your body, right? It takes up 20% of the caloric intake of your body. It takes up only a small percentage of your body size, but it uses a vast amount of energy. So the brain is very, very important. And when you think about how much information you actually have in your brain, the memories and everything that's stored in your brain, it's really quite phenomenal. And we need to think about the fact that your brain is an amazing powerhouse of informational capacity of all the functions and everything associated with it. But I was curious to know how much information, how much data could the human brain actually store? So I did some research, and it's really quite astonishing. But I'm going to illustrate this by pointing out that the the Apollo mission that landed on the moon used a computer with 64 kilobytes of computer memory, which is very small. If you are at all familiar with the size of kilobytes and megabytes and gigabytes and everything else, you'll know that 64 kilobytes is a very small amount of memory. And that 64 kilobytes translates roughly to being able to have the computing power for 64,000 characters of code. So that's the machine that landed on the moon. Your cell phone has, anywhere from, I don't know, most of the phones are like 16 gigabytes up to 128 or maybe 256 gigabytes right in the palm of your hand, right? And there's more computing power in the palm of your hand than that which landed on the moon. That's a well-known fact. It's been referenced lots of times, right? So your phone is vastly superior to that which landed on the moon. Now, your brain can actually store, from the research that I've been reading and what I've been looking at, but that your brain can actually store 2.5 petabytes of data or information, right? Which and have that kind of power. 2.5 petabytes, if you're not familiar with the term, translates to 2.5 million gigabytes, which is huge, right? It's astronomical. So my point is to illustrate that leaders always need to be learning. You have the capacity to learn. Having an information overload is probably more to do with processing what you're consuming, whether it's reading or watching or listening to some content. But that informational overload has more to do with needing time to process what you're consuming versus not having the bandwidth to take it in. So always be learning. Number 2 is that leaders set the bar. So these are 2 things to know, right? Always be learning. Number 2, leaders set the bar. As a leader, your team will rise to your level and no higher, unless they get, outside influence. But for the most part, the leader is sort of the cap of the ceiling on the growth of the team, right? So generally speaking, if you want your team to keep growing, you need to understand that the team is going to rise to the level of the leader, and unless there is a catalyst to push them further, they're only going to be able to come to that point. So as a leader, you want to be raising the bar higher and higher by continuing to learn, by continuing to take on information, by continuing to improve and grow your own capacity to lead your team, to grow your team, to develop yourself. And as you continue to grow, you have the ability to continue raising the bar so that you can continue to develop and grow your people. So it's important to be aware of that and to recognize that if you want to continue to develop your team, you have to continue to develop yourself. So focus on that as well. And then the third thing is the thing to do, which is to have a growth practice. And what I mean by having a growth practice is that there's a little bit of trial and error involved in growing, and there's a little bit of discomfort in growing, and there's a little bit of fear in some ways, like, because growing is not always comfortable, right? If it's comfortable, it's probably not challenging enough, right? If you feel comfortable all the time that you're growing, you're probably not growing quite in the right way. You probably need to challenge yourself a little bit more. You probably need to dig a little deeper and uncover some uncomfortable moments for yourself to actually experience some real growth. So having a growth practice means that you're consuming content, you're internalizing content, the processing part, and then you're seeking ways to apply what you've learned, right? And so you're applying these principles, or you're applying new ways of leading, growing, managing your team, leading, growing, managing yourself, whatever that case might be. But you have to actually develop this practice where you learn, or you consume content, you consume information, you process the information, and then you apply the information. And there are some things that you need to think about just in terms of maintaining good health for yourself, because your brain and your body need adequate amounts of energy to be able to function properly, and particularly for your brain health, right? We know that information coming in leads to thoughts, feelings, and actions, right? What you read is information. It makes you think. What you think makes you feel something. What you feel makes you do something. So there's a kind of a linear process there, right? But for your brain to be at its best, it needs adequate food, needs adequate, good, healthy input, so that your brain can be healthy and be ready to receive and be ready to function properly. It needs adequate amounts of sleep, and it's always helpful to engage your brain in exercise, mental activities, to challenge and to keep it fit, so to speak. And you don't have to listen to me about that, but you can easily do a quick Google search and find all kinds of information about why it's important for you to eat properly, sleep on a regular, and have some brain training activity. It's no different to if you want to have good, healthy muscles, that you need to engage in some physical activity on a regular basis, right? So these are some things to consider as well in part of your growth practice, is how are you kind of taking care of your mind, your brain, and your body. So these are a few thoughts that I have about growing like you mean it. 2 things to know: always be learning, and leaders set the bar. And 1 thing to do, which is have a growth practice. So there's lots of opportunities out there to seek out growth. You can read a book, watch a show, listen to a podcast, get a coach, get a mentor, any number of different ways of experiencing growth. I have 1 option for you. You can try out my Leadership Growth Challenge. It's a series of 7 questions over the course of 7 days. It gets delivered to you by email. You can sign up for that. Link's in the show notes. You can go to my website and find it there as well. It's a quick little free tool that you can try out and see how that works for you, just by thinking about some questions and answering them in your way. And that's definitely 1 option for you. Other options are out there. Seek it out, and just grow like you mean it. So I hope this gives you some food for thought. Thanks for listening today. Leave me some feedback. Send me an email, podcast@weeklyleadershipexperience.com. I look forward to speaking with you again next week. In the meantime, stay awesome.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, would you head over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe, leave me a rating, leave me a review, and share this with a friend. It spreads the word and helps the podcast grow. You can also find me on social media at R.E. Oberlander. Until next time, stay awesome.